many people is in here. This is not your regular meetup, I guess. Okay, so I'm going to talk about real-time and GraphQL. And there's not much time, just 20 minutes is, I think I had a talk for 45 minutes, had to compress it a little. So let's see how it goes. Okay, good. Oh, of course. Okay, so I'm a Google developer expert, and you can see I have lots of fun doing events and conferences and things like that. I'm also doing some Master of Ceremonies gigs, which is also fun. I'm a blogger. I'm usually covering Angular topics, but I'm also exploring React now that I'm playing with GraphQL. And this is my first blog, which I built some prototype using both technologies. So if you want to check how a GraphQL application looks using Angular, you can also look at this blog post. I'm also an international speaker, so you can see I'm all over the place. So it's not only React London. There are some other places. Probably the most exotic is the one in Japan. But yeah, it's all good. Some bragging. I'm also a trainer, basically around Angular. But probably I will start doing some GraphQL training at some point. Maybe you recognize some of the people in the picture. I'm also a community leader, so I run 2 meetups here in London, Angular Zone, and also GraphQL London. Probably some of you have attended to one of these meetups. It's quite popular. You can see that the GraphQL community is already beating the Angular community, so I guess that's good. So let's cover a little bit of GraphQL. Before I go into real time, I want to give some heads up. So some of you maybe are new to GraphQL, you haven't been following the news. So I'm going to try to cover some of those. So one of the tools that Apollo announced earlier this year, is this Launchpad. And this is interesting because you can build your GraphQL server online and share the URL, which will be an endpoint, a valid endpoint. So this is perfect for prototyping and small demos. They also use it together with Expo, so you can get nice React Native prototypes running online. So that's something you should check out. Another thing that it's interesting, it's the new website, which is GraphQL Explore. And this replaces the old one, which is GraphQL.org. And it's basically covering all of the different stacks. So obviously, we are more interested in JavaScript stack, but there are other stacks available. So if you are starting to use GraphQL, this is the best place to start. There are tutorials for the different platforms, and this is the go-to page. Something else. So there was GraphQL Europe a few months ago, and now, end of October, it's going to be the GraphQL Summit. I mean, if you are interested, there's still tickets on sale, and I would say that it's highly recommended. I mean, if you can go to San Francisco, or you are around. So let's talk about HandsUp app. So this is a application that I found myself interested when I was attending React London, the conference. And they started to use this Slido application. And this is a Q&A application that you can use during a conference. And all of the attendees can go there and ask questions and participate. And I thought, okay, let's look at it. And I saw that it's like really expensive. I mean, the subscription starts at $200 just to have it in place. And I was thinking, like, this is a really easy application. I mean, this is like 2, 3 operations. This should be easy. So I started building what will be this HandsUp application. So let's see how it works. So you can see the interface. This is open, so you can use it on your mobile if you want. Don't do it now. Anyway, it's recorded. So you can see this is the app. There's some question that I'm using kind of an information for the attendees. There's some information about who posted, and there is this flashy animation I copied from Periscope. Then I also introduce authentication, and I'm using Auth0. So I can also log in, and then once you are logged in, you can type new questions. Otherwise, you will be an anonymous user, so you can only vote for the questions. And this is probably one of the most hot questions in the GraphQL arena. So which is it? Relay Modern or Apollo? And this is just an example of how the interaction would work. And as you can see, this is now using my account. I cannot vote my own questions. I mean, this is some reasonable limitation. I also have some roles implemented. So what I did is I created a different role so I can moderate the questions as they happen. So when I'm a moderator, then I can just toggle if I see some misbehavior in the questions, and I can just use this. I can also block you. So if you do something silly, I can block you. And this is more or less the interaction. This is actually the tool that was used during the panel at GraphQL Europe. And it was quite a stressful time. I mean, these were like 300 people during an hour. And this is using a real-time application. So that means that every message that goes into the app is being broadcast to all of the clients. So I counted around 3 million messages during that hour. And everything worked as expected. So, I mean, it's a really solid architecture that is available to everyone because this is open source. So I built this app, as you have seen. Let's see the architecture. So the architecture is going to be using React. And for users authentication, I'm using Auth0, which is quite easy to plug in. And then on the client side, I'm using Apollo Client. As for the server, I wasn't that much interested in building my own GraphQL server, so I use GraphQL. And GraphQL gives you few options. It gives you a console. It also gives you a CLI that we are going to cover later. And it's very easy to kind of set it up and just have the GraphQL server running from the get-go. So let's see the schema. I'm going to understand that you have some previous knowledge. I mean, I don't have time to introduce the syntax for the schema, but maybe we can look. This is the real schema, so there's nothing hidden. We just have like a really easy model. So we have questions, users, and votes. And I had to do some tricks because obviously I had no access to the backend. I couldn't implement any logic on the backend. So in order to run the voting count, I had to use some fancy feature from GraphQL, which aggregates the entries from another for a type, and then it adds them as metadata. So it's kind of a hacky solution, but I mean, it's all free. So if you want to look at that, how I did it, it's quite fun. So one of the advantages of using GraphQL is that it also comes with nice tooling. And we haven't seen the console, but this is the CLI. And as you can see, what you can do, if we look on the right side, is we can just install it, and then just calling init, it will just set it up for our project. Once we have our project set up, we can just create a schema locally, and then we can push it into the GraphQL server. That will create a schema on the server with some extra features that GraphQL is offering for you, like pagination and some other nice features that are baked on your schema automatically. And then we can also access the console. So maybe I'm going to do a little demo of the console. The console is just a web client, and we have different features. So we can access the data. Of course, we have access to the questions, the users, and the bots. I didn't purge the bots, so I have some old bots here. As for the questions, okay, someone had to post this. But the good thing, the good thing is I can flag it, and it's really quick. So flagged, yes. Sorry. So now the fun is over. So now any clients that were using the app would not be able to see this message. So it's really cool. Then I have a lot of users that I can change the roles and everything. There's also a nice tab to control the permissions. So one thing that I usually use when the event is over is I just block the authorization to create new questions. So there's no people adding questions after the event is finished. There's also some nice integrations. I'm using the one with Auth0. And then now they are also extending into this microservices, arena, which I completely don't understand. But what I guess it's doing is making you enabling you to run some random code in the cloud. So the moment you have access to a node instance or who knows what is on this function, then you can run some code to make calculations, or maybe after you add a question, you do some extra checks there. There's also a playground which integrates the graphical tool, which is a nice interface to do queries and see the results. So for example, I have this query, which it's showing all the questions and also the flag ones. And we can see it's returning a JSON. So I can also see, now we have an example to show the flag question with, it's also supporting emojis, if you care for that. And that's pretty much all. We can also test subscriptions, which is really cool. But let's see if I have time. So let's move on. So for the Apollo client, so we decided to use Apollo, but I could also use now Relay Modern. So you have different options. You could also use vanilla JavaScript. I mean, it just depends how comfortable you are. But for this app, I choose Apollo client. And this is more or less the architecture of the app. So we can see there's the GraphQL server, and then the client is using these two different APIs. One is for querying, fetching information, and the other one is for adding changes, which is the Mutation API. So let's move quickly. There are some dependencies to take into account. So if you want to build an Apollo client, you need to add these dependencies. This is mostly to help you out in doing the queries and also having the content catch, so you don't have to do extra queries if you don't need to. There's also the nice integration with React, so you can add some of these queries into the props of your components, and it just fits nicely. We also have something new that I want to cover today, which is the GraphQL Loader. And this is a feature that will compile your queries during build time. Before that, we were using GraphQL tag to build the queries that were compiled in runtime. So this is an improvement. Let's see some examples of that. So the way we access that feature is changing our Webpack build setup. So we need to add a loader that will traverse our project, finding these GraphQL extensions, and then compile them for us. There's some nice features that come with this. One of them is that we can reference fragments from these GraphQL query files. And the syntax is using this hash import. And we can see two examples. So this is a query to get all the questions. As you can see, it's using the question fragment, using with the import syntax. And then we can also see another example of how to create a new question. And this is also using the fragment. In both examples, this is changing the shape of the information coming back from the GraphQL server. So let's see that fragment. So the question fragment is pointing to the question type, and it's just adding the fields that we want to get, in these other different queries. The good practice is that once we define this fragment, we can start using it in different places. In HandsUp application, this is used on every interaction with the server. So if I add a new field, I don't have to worry. It will be available for all the mutations, all the queries, etc. As you can see, there's some hack here for the bots. But yeah, that works nicely. There's also the flagging and also the moderation and the user that posted the question, which is integrated with Auth0. So you can find a lot of nice examples in this app. Let's see some code for the setup. So this is not so much interesting. We can see that we have the endpoint from GraphQL, and then we just get this client that comes from this new instance of Apollo client. What we can see is that during Bootstrap, we can use it to pass it down to the different components in our applications. Here, maybe I added some extra complication. This is an example of showing how you can integrate your Redux store with the Apollo Redux store. Apollo comes with a Redux implementation that you can access, and the way you could mix these two, like your own app reducers and the reducers from Apollo, is by running this code. This complicates things a little bit. But basically, that's following the pattern that React uses. So we are just passing the store as high-order component using this Apollo provider. And then this will mean that we have access within our app to this store and client, which makes total sense. So the main APIs that we have to fetch and mutate data are this query and mutate. Then mutate also uses update queries, which is reducer implementation. If we see the operations I'm going to cover, I'm going to just follow the schema. So as you can see, queries and mutations also follow the schema definition. They are just a different type. So we have all questions that are going to give us all of the questions in the system, and create question that it's going to change or add a question for us. For an example code snippet for query, we can see the pattern that we are going to see in a lot of the places. This is not using the external files. This is using the GraphQL tag. But the thing that you should use is there's an external reference to the file instead of using GraphQL tag. This will change the performance in runtime. So this is not a best practice, but it's good to show the example. What we are using here is we are extending the properties in our component, and that is going to be executed by that GraphQL high-order function. And that is going to add the props with the results of our query. So what is happening in the next lines is we are going to extend this component that is executing this query and adding this list property. And that will get the results of the query. these two properties should match the actual query from the GraphQL query. Okay, for mutations, it follows a similar approach. So we have the mutation here, we have some parameters, some arguments that we are passing to the create question function. And here we can see how we are using the Redux approach. We can also see we are passing some variables to the mutation. And then on the update queries, I'm going to change the state of the Redux store by using the same entry. As you all probably know, we need to keep a new reference for the new state. So I'm just creating a new array containing all of the questions plus the one that was just created. Okay, so we've seen that. So let's get into subscriptions. I'm a little bit over time, so let's cover it as fast as possible. So we have this similar architecture now covering real time. So real time comes with this extra logic that it's going to track the events that comes after executing a mutation and storing them in a separate store. Once, this is to avoid losing these events. So we are storing them, and then the moment we are broadcasting the events, they are going on a separate pipeline that it's facing the subscription API. If you imagine a HandsUp application, this is when we create a new question. We will have a mutation that will be being tracked. And that is going to send a broadcast message that will be originated by these events. And then that's going to be not just one message, but one message for every subscriber. The dependencies for subscriptions are these. That's the setup, very similar to what we saw before. So we have two different network interfaces. For the new version of Apollo client, the Apollo team is working on a separate stack that will avoid having these two separate network interfaces, so we can just use a common one. And that's called GraphQL Link or Apollo Link, I think. But this is using the old approach. So now we are going to use the new client, which is combining the client that we have for queries and mutation with the one with real time that is using a WebSocket network interface. For subscriptions, the schema is a little bit different. What we are doing is filtering. If you remember the architecture diagram, we have these events. So we can filter the different events that we want to take into account. What I'm using for HandsUp is I'm only interested on new questions. So I'm going to broadcast new created questions. So that's going to be this filter that you can see in Mutation in. We can also track deletions and updates. And it very much follows the same syntax as the regular queries. For subscriptions to run, the code looks more or less like this. And we use the same approach, so we have a reducer. The moment we get one of these messages from the server, we can then use the information to update our list of questions. The only thing that happens is that if you see there's a code to handle duplicates. And if you think about it, when you are the originator of a new question, you are also going to receive the same message from the server. The server is not controlling who is originating the messages. So you create a new question, you also get, as you subscribe to these subscriptions for new questions, you will also get a message. So you just have to handle that. Okay, so that's all. You have everything and more described in this blog post. So if you want to follow up, you have how I set it up, auth0, the animations, the different things that happen in the app. I mean, it's not easy to concentrate that in 20 minutes. You have access to that on my GitHub. And that's all. Thank you very much. What kind of surprised me is that it was very much like another copy of Apollo client. So they changed the classic, what is called the Relay Classic, to look very much like Apollo client. So now they are very much the same, which is, I mean, which is fine. I think they are trying to make it up to you to decide which of the two you can use. I've seen that most of the comparisons between the two, they were using the compiler as an extra thing from Relay. But as I have shown you, we have the same in Apollo. So the features are more or less the same today. You can decide. It depends on your team, I guess. Sure.
And I guess Apollo doesn't have any additional extensions to GraphQL. Like Relay Classic did, right? So it added a whole bunch of some stuff extra.
Well, the things that Relay Classic, I mean, the complaints about Relay Classic is usually the boilerplate and the JSON structures that come from pagination and some operations that become a little bit cumbersome. But I don't think it's that you cannot implement some features. It's just that maybe it doesn't look that nice. But now it has improved a lot with Relay Modern. So I would say like they are very close. Maybe there's some feature better in one or the other, but I mean, it's not easy to say at this point.
Cool. Is there any more questions? Oh, come on. Oh.
Hi, if all your information is from one data source, so not like you're polling from Twitter and a database, is there any real reason why we should be using GraphQL? Does it give you anything extra, say, just using Socket.io and doing your own subscriptions and things like that?
Well, the question,
so if you've only got one data source, is there any really convincing reason why we should use GraphQL?
Well, the reason to use GraphQL is because it's kind of an integrator. It's not replacing. Some people think that it's replacing REST APIs or some other APIs, but actually it's integrating them. And what it adds is the ability to abstract the layer of querying. So you don't depend on the different endpoints, but you just have a GraphQL endpoint that allows you to do complex queries that doesn't depend on the actual layout. So you don't depend on the different endpoints that usually is the way REST APIs work. So it's kind of a generic approach to any kind of APIs.
Yeah, so just abstracting.
Yeah, you could use memory, you could use files, you could use anything, really. It's not really linked to a REST API. You could just play with some files and use GraphQL to just pull some static files. I mean, it just depends what you're doing on the server side. You are using the GraphQL infrastructure to abstract the queries, but then the actual information source, it's independent. You could use anything, actually. So we haven't seen that, but obviously when you have a query, it splits the query in different resolvers, and then how you implement the resolver for these different types defined in your schema. The implementation then will tell if you are using, I don't know, if you are using MongoDB and one REST API to just fill some fields, part of the query. I mean, it's up to you. We haven't got time to show that, but it's really powerful.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Okay.
Great. Any more questions? Cool. Are there any questions on there?
Yeah, I think people is not happy to ask questions. A little bit
Cool.
lazy.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much,
No
Gerard.
worries.
Thank you.